Right, let's jump straight into this explainer. We're looking at the deeply tragic, and honestly, completely avoidable loss of the U.S. cargo ship, the El Faro. It's like a giant puzzle where every single piece went wrong. We'll break down the exact mechanics of this disaster, the freak weather, the cascade of engineering failures, and the human decisions that all collided to create one of the absolute worst maritime tragedies in recent American history.
Part 1. A ship goes missing. Picture this, October 1st, 2015. A massive, 790-foot cargo vessel essentially vanishes into the Caribbean.
The El Faro was supposed to be on a totally routine run, right? Just heading from Jacksonville, Florida down to Puerto Rico. But somewhere near the Bahamas, all communication just went dead. We have this agonizing distress call from the captain, which is really the climax of our story, sent as his ship faced overwhelming, catastrophic forces. When he finally got through to the emergency operator, his words were desperate. The ship had taken on water, lost power, and was completely at the mercy of the ocean. He said, "The clock is ticking." And tragically, time was already up.
The horrific reality of this whole thing really comes down to one number, 33. Every single one of the 33 souls on board, that's 28 American crew members and 5 Polish maintenance hands, were lost to the sea. The Coast Guard flew 42 separate search sorties. They were flying in brutal, incredibly turbulent conditions, sweeping nearly 200,000 square miles of ocean, but all they found were crushed lifeboats and a debris field. So to understand how a modern steel freighter with a highly experienced crew met this fate, we really need to look at the forces arrayed against them.
That brings us to Part 2, Anatomy of a Hurricane. We need to understand the monstrous weather system that literally swallowed them whole.
You see, Hurricane Joaquin became such an unpredictable killer because of a wild meteorological phenomenon called rapid intensification. Here's how it works. Because Joaquin was moving incredibly slowly over unusually warm tropical waters, it was able to just continuously extract massive amounts of heat energy. Basically, it kept mixing in more and more warm water. It was acting exactly like a giant engine running on an endless fuel supply.
If we track Joaquin's terrifying leap in strength, you can see how fast this builds. In less than 24 hours, it morphed from a minimal hurricane to a Category 3, and then it just ramped up to packing 120-mile-per-hour winds. Forecasting its track and intensity proved unusually difficult, which meant if any mariner out there was relying on old information, they were in serious, serious peril.
Which leads us to Part 3, the fatal miscalculation. Why on earth did a veteran captain deliberately sail a fully loaded freighter directly into an intensifying hurricane?
Look, the route down to Puerto Rico definitely offers places where a ship can sort of tuck behind barrier islands to hold up and wait for a storm to pass. Sure, it adds distance and time, but it absolutely ensures survival. Yet the El Faro just kept steaming straight ahead. Now, the ship's voyage data recorder, and we'll talk a lot more about that later, revealed a deadly disconnect on the bridge. The crew was actually using a system called SATC. This printed out loud, constant, real-time updates from the National Hurricane Center. So the bridge crew was plotting totally accurate, live data. But the captain? He was down in his cabin, stubbornly relying on a separate program called the Bon Voyage System, or BVS. These reports were sent via email directly to him, and the kicker is, they were consistently 6 hours out of date.
By the time second mate Danielle Randolph mapped the true course up on the bridge, the devastating reality was literally staring them in the face. The live data showed the hurricane sitting squarely over their track line. Randolph actually plotted it out and realized they were on a direct collision course with the eye of the storm. Meanwhile, the captain actually believed they were sneaking around the back of the storm to save time because he was relying on those old, inaccurate emails. But the crew, they knew the horrifying truth.
Despite repeated, totally accurate warnings from the crew to shelter behind nearby islands, the captain ordered them to just push through. Third mate Jeremy Ream actually called the captain at 11 p.m. to suggest heading south, to open up some distance. The captain declined. 2 hours later, second mate Randolph called the captain again, practically begging to change course. He again said no. That led her to hang up the phone, turn to her colleague, and deliver this incredibly dark, fatalistic line. He said to run it. Hold on to your ass.
Now you might be wondering, why didn't the crew just mutiny right then and there? Well, it all comes down to a rigid, 10,000-year-old chain of command that heavily punishes subordinate intervention. In the maritime world, tradition dictates the captain is the absolute sole master aboard, second only to God, basically. The aviation industry dealt with this exact issue back in the 1970s. They completely overhauled cockpit dynamics so co-pilots could formally challenge captains. But out on the sea, challenging the captain's authority simply wasn't built into the culture, even when you're sailing straight toward death.
And that brings us to part 4, the final hours. Trapped inside the Eye of Joaquin with 60-knot winds, the El Faro began a catastrophic mechanical breakdown.
It was a devastating cascade of engineering failures that ultimately doomed the vessel. First, the severe winds literally pinned the massive ship into a 15-degree lean, or list, over to the starboard side. Because of this extreme tilt, water began flooding through an open access hatch called a scuttle on deck 2. It was draining directly into a lower cargo hold. So in a totally desperate attempt to correct this, the captain adjusted their course to put the wind on the opposite side. This shifted the ship to a 15-degree port list. But here is the absolutely fatal flaw. The main engine's oil suction pipe was offset to the starboard side. So with the ship leaning hard to port, that pipe lifted completely out of the oil. The engine sucked in nothing but air. And at exactly 6:13 a.m., the massive ship lost all power.
Look, without propulsion, a ship in a storm is entirely helpless. There's just no way around it. The hurricane simply blew the dead ship completely onto its side. Water started flooding down the ventilation shafts, and trapped up on the bridge, able seaman Frank Ham found himself in a completely desperate, truly heartbreaking struggle to survive. The audio transcripts capture his final, panicked moments, literally begging the captain for help as the massive steel vessel began to succumb to the sea. Despite the crew's immense bravery, the relentless Category 4 hurricane simply overpowered the dead vessel. At 7:29 a.m., with the ship totally helpless and sideways, the captain officially rang the alarm to abandon ship and ordered the life rafts deployed. But let's be real, in a Category 4 hurricane, survival in the open water is basically impossible. The breaking waves and immense sea spray literally make it impossible to breathe. Ultimately, the El Faro was pulled 3 miles down to the ocean floor, coming to rest 15,000 feet deep in the mud.
Part 5. A Legacy of Change. You see, this tragedy did not end at the bottom of the ocean, and that's all thanks to the undeniable truth later recovered by the National Transportation Safety Board. The initial assumption by pretty much everyone was that this was just an unforeseeable act of God, right? A tragic accident of weather. But marine investigators launched one of the most complex, massive inquiries in their history, sending remote vehicles miles below the surface. 10 months after the sinking, they actually found the ship's voyage data recorder, the marine equivalent of an airplane's black box. It was 15,000 feet deep. The memory chips inside held 26 hours of audio from the bridge, and the transcripts proved undeniably that the crew accurately recognized the danger. They tracked the storm correctly, and they desperately tried to speak up. It completely shifted the narrative from a weather anomaly to a catastrophic failure of leadership and communication. But out of this immense grief came real, tangible legislative change. Frank Ham's wife fought absolutely tirelessly, and in October 2018, the Ham Alert Maritime Safety Act was signed into law. This act is a huge deal. It finally gives seafarers an anonymous, protected way to report life-threatening safety violations. Literally by pressing a button, mariners can alert the Coast Guard directly, completely bypassing the captain without fear of losing their jobs or facing retaliation. It ensures that the voices of the crew can finally be heard over the rigid chain of command.
So, we want to leave you with this final thought, maybe something to think about for your own workplace. The El Faro disaster highlights a universal flaw in rigid hierarchies. When a catastrophic decision comes from the very top, do you have a safe way to speak up before it's too late? Ask yourself, if disaster was looming in your organization, would you be empowered and protected enough to actually stop it? Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.